Okay, great. I think that we can start. Good morning. I think it's good afternoon to some of you, depending on which part of the globe you are. Welcome to this session. I think that we've had a very inspiring and very challenging food for thought, actually, plenary session this morning that gives us a very good link to what this session is going to be about, which is advocacy in terms of how can we participants in this session and our colleagues and our contacts and networks, really build this partnership and solidarity around the investment, the protection for the health workforce. But I think that there's a lot of things that came out in the morning plenary session. I think Dr. Saeed and Judy highlighted on the importance of this partnership, to ensure this vaccine solidarity. And Dr. Saleha's own testimony and short video, I think, was the highlight, also highlighting the funding issues that will emerge in this session. So this session is about information sharing. It's about sharing our experiences and what we are doing, what we are thinking of doing, and what we are planning, and just to share experiences and knowledge and brainstorm together in terms of how we can take this partnership and solidarity to the next level when it comes to advocacy. So it's a learning session. So it's not just that we want to hear from what the speakers have to tell us, but I think we also want to hear from the participants in the session in terms of what's going on in the corners of the globe where you are, what are you engaged in, and how can we connect and link and build this momentum. So just a bit of an introduction to VEMOS, who kind of like supporting and chairing and coordinating this session. We are a Dutch rights to health advocacy NGO, civil society organization, doing a lot of advocacy on global health in the global context, in the Dutch context, as well as in the EU, but also building a lot of solidarity and partnerships with civil society from across the globe, especially in the low-income, resource-limited context. We have three main focus areas: access to medicines, human resources for health, and financing to health. But also, most recently, we are working on intersectional sexual and reproductive health and rights. And so just a quick introduction to the speakers and presenters for this session. First will be Tom Buis, who is a global health advocate at VEMOS, and he has been involved and very active in the Dutch national advocacy for setup, which is what he will speak about today when it comes to equitable, access to vaccines. Previously, Tom has been also involved in the Dutch initiatives to promote the attachment of conditions to public funding that would then promote accessibility to new pharmaceutical products. And Miriam is one of the also global health advocates at VEMOS. She has clinical background and so relates to a lot of the conversations that have already been highlighted and taken place this morning. And she's worked both in the private and public sectors and hospitals in Greece and in Scotland. And she has a master's degree from Maastricht University in the Netherlands and specialized in global health policy, economics, and management. And so she works at VEMOS a lot on financing for health dossier, as well as human resources for health. And so I think she will build up and touch on some of the points and some of the statistics and figures that Dr. Saleha mentioned. I think it was interesting to see the UK cut already in terms of ODA from 0.7 to 0.5. And so she will touch on what does that mean and what can we do and what are the alternatives and just where do we go from here. And so with that, I would like to hand over to Tom, who will take us through the first presentation. Thanks, and over to you, Tom.
Thank you for that introduction, Amanda, and also a big thanks to the organizers for letting us talk on this important topic of ensuring sustainable access to COVID-19 vaccines. So next slide, please. So the topics I will discuss are vaccine availability at this moment globally, And I will talk about some of the issues surrounding equitable access of COVID-19 vaccines, but also other COVID-19 technologies. And I will provide an example of a possible solution to make that access more equitable. And I will share some highlights of the national advocacy we have done in the Netherlands. And then my colleague Mirja will talk about financing for health systems in regards to COVID-19. Next slide, please. So the goal of my presentation is to provide you with information on the global and national actions that are needed to make sure we achieve global equitable access in COVID-19. And I hope to provide you with enough information in order for you to be able to advocate for an increase in global manufacturing capacity, resulting in greater access to COVID-19 technologies. So before I start with my first few slides, I would like for you guys to fill in these polls, because I'm really curious to see what you already know about this topic, and that also helps me out a lot with the rest of the presentation. So the first question, what is Colfax vaccine distribution goal? So Colfax is a global mechanism that I will talk about in a few minutes. And then the second question is, how much of the global vaccine supply is reserved for high-income countries that represent 16% of the global population? So if you could just fill out your answers. Oh, and then we have the third and the fourth questions. Those are for Mirja's part, but I think you could also fill those in as well. I think the answers I will mention during my slides. So we will get back to those. So next slide, please, Rosanna. So what we see here is a global map that has been made by The Economist, and it states when, or it makes an estimate of when COVID-19 vaccines will be widely available per country. And what we see is a stark divide between high-income countries and low and middle-income countries. And then more specifically, we see a stark divide between the African region and Europe and Northern America. And there's some very severe consequences to this inequality in accessing COVID-19 vaccines. So when this inequality continues, it will extend the duration of the pandemic, which will obviously lead to more deaths and more people affected by the disease. But there's also economic consequences to this inequality. So RAND Europe made some estimations and some calculation that if lower countries are not supported and certain regions remain excluded from vaccination, it will cost wealthier countries around $119 billion a year. And it's estimated by the same organization, RAND, that the one-off cost for vaccinating low and middle income countries could be around $25 billion. So that could make a very good case for investing in access to COVID-19 vaccines in low and middle income countries. Moreover, because when we don't deal with this inequitable access to COVID-19 vaccines, and we don't deal with this pandemic through a global mechanism, we are at risk of an increase in mutations. As long as there is a big pool of people that are at risk of being infected by the virus, then the chances of mutations are bigger as well. And those mutations could lead to less effective vaccines or infections with a more deadly outcome, of higher chances of a deadly outcome. So this is not something we are doing just for the regions in the global south. That's an argument we are trying to convince Dutch politicians as well, like we're doing this for ourselves as well. So there is a global mechanism that is in place in order to achieve a more fair distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, and it's called COVAX. And it's run by the WHO, CEPI, and Gavi. And COVAX aim is to deliver a COVID-19 vaccine for 20% of the populations in some low and middle income countries. So not all low and middle income countries. So it's especially low income countries and the lower middle income countries. So it's 49 in total, if I'm not mistaken. And I think it's a good mechanism because it looks at a fair distribution of the vaccines that are available. But there are some downsides. First of all, it's the 20% that is the goal. So today I want to talk to you about how can we go past that goal of 20%, because we just had elections here in the Netherlands the day before yesterday. And I think if any of the candidates for parliament stated that the Dutch goal of vaccinating its population would be 20%, then people would be outraged. So if we think that 20% is unacceptable here in Europe, why do we think it's acceptable in other countries around the world? So I think we have to come up with solutions to go past that 20%. And another problem is that a lot of high income countries buy up vaccines. So COVAX can only distribute the crumbs, so to say. And I think another downside of COVAX is that it's the system, the way it's set up is that high income countries financially support COVAX in buying vaccines for low and middle income countries. So it's still very much a donation or charity-based system. And I think what we want is a more sustainable solution to this pandemic, but also to future pandemics. So next slide, please. So like I briefly mentioned, so vaccine nationalism is a big part of why low income countries cannot access COVID-19 vaccines. So there have been some very progressive statements made by European leaders. So I highlight one of them. So Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, stated on the 5th of May in 2020, so that's fairly early on in the pandemic, that we need to create a truly unique and global public good. So that is a very powerful statement, I think, but what we have seen in terms of actions has been quite the opposite. So I think a good example of that is the Inclusive Vaccine Alliance that started with France, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands. And those countries joined forces in order to buy vaccines and pre-invest in manufacturing capacity and R&D with public funds in private companies. And I don't think that necessarily is a bad thing, but what these countries expected in return for this public financing is preferential access. And so basically saying, okay, we invest a next number of millions of euros in your company, but in return, as soon as the first batches of vaccines or other pharmaceutical products come out and they're approved by the regulators, then we want to be the first. And I think especially that demand from countries was very damaging for an equitable distribution of pharmaceutical products. And now this initiative of the Inclusive Vaccine Alliance has been taken over by the European Commission, as we all know. So now the European Commission buys up these vaccines for all its member states. But again, there's a lot of countries that are left out because of that. So we have to find a solution for that. And then the number that was also mentioned in the poll. So at this moment, there's 60% of the global vaccines for 2021 will go to countries that house only 16% of the global population. So this is basically the number behind the map that I just showed you in the previous slide. So next slide, please. So a lot of the problems that I have mentioned in the previous slides are because of a lack of sufficient global manufacturing. This is the case for vaccines, but also for potential, yes, thank you. Also for potential medicines, for treatments like antibodies. So manufacturing capacity is a central theme in ensuring that everyone around the world has equitable access to COVID-19 technologies. And what we see now is that a lot of the manufacturing capacity and research, for that matter, is focused and concentrated in just a few regions around the world. So we know that in Northern America, in Europe, in India, in China, and in Russia, there's actually quite a bit of manufacturing capacity, but it's not enough to supply the world with enough doses. So what we ideally want to see is what you can see on the right side. It's a decentralized global network of manufacturing capacity. And in order to create that, we need a new mechanism. And that's, I will explain in the next slide, please. So there's two main barriers in achieving new generic manufacturing capacity. And that first barrier is intellectual property. So intellectual property gives the owner the exclusive right to produce or use the technology that he or she invented or bought up, therefore limiting others in doing so, in producing it or using the technology. So when supplying COVID-19 vaccines are a bottleneck, you don't want your manufacturers to be limited by patents. So this is barrier number one. And then the second barrier is know-how. So vaccines are fairly complex biological products that require extensive knowledge and experience to produce. So even if IP barriers like patents were lifted, then a lack of knowledge could still draw back global manufacturing capacity. So this is why the WHO has come up with a global mechanism to share intellectual property and to share know-how for the production of COVID-19 technologies. And this is called the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool. So pharmaceutical companies can share and contribute to the COVID-19 pool, to CTAP, and in return they get a fair financial compensation. So we've made a short info video, which I think explains a lot better how it actually works. So Hosanna, if you could please share the video.
We all want the corona pandemic to end as quickly as possible. To achieve this, everyone in the world needs to be protected. Nobody is safe until everyone is safe. At this moment, however, only a few pharmaceutical companies are producing vaccines that are proven to be safe and effective. This is not nearly enough to supply the whole world. With rich countries buying up most of the vaccines, people in low-income countries may not be vaccinated until 2024. But there is a solution using a pooling mechanism like the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool. In such a pool, pharmaceutical companies voluntarily share their patent rights and, in addition, all knowledge necessary to make COVID-19 diagnostics, medicines, and vaccines. In return, they receive fair compensation. With these patent rights and knowledge, other pharmaceutical companies can produce vaccines to make enough for all of us. Since the vaccines have been developed with billions of euros of taxpayers' money, sharing of patent rights and knowledge by pharmaceutical companies would only be fair. Such a pooling mechanism can also help Colfax, the international initiative supporting low and middle-income countries in obtaining COVID-19 vaccines. The more factories are producing vaccines, the more and faster vaccines can be distributed through Colfax. Sounds like a utopia? It's not. The medicines patent pool successfully helps reduce the AIDS epidemic, making HIV medicines accessible to many people around the world. We could do the same for COVID-19 and save millions of lives. The pandemic is having a tremendous negative impact on our health, our societies, and our economies. And new mutations of the virus might make current vaccines less effective. We cannot wait any longer. We must seize the opportunity of sharing patent rights and knowledge so we can all live our lives again, wherever we live. Governments and pharmaceutical companies around the world, step up to end the pandemic quickly. Make pooling work.
Yes, thank you, Rosanna. So please, the next slide. Yes, so this will be my final slide. So currently the CTAP is empty and it only has support from 50 WHO member states, around plus minus 50 member states. So this is not enough. So what we have done early on in the pandemic is to also advocate for CTAP in the national context here in the Netherlands. And what we see is a great link between national policies and global policies and vice versa. So how they really affect each other. And what we did early on in the pandemic is we wrote a joint letter together with Dutch NGOs, political youth organizations, but also public health experts, experts on access to medicines. And we sent that to the Dutch government and to parliaments saying, okay, we need you to support CTAP because of, well, all the reasons I mentioned before. And we were able to provide a political party with a draft motion that they took over and put forward in the parliament. And that motion was accepted, which resulted in our Minister of Health officially supporting CTAP and also making a statement at the World Health Assembly last year in 2020. And he was actually the only, I think one of the only member states representatives that highlighted the need for sharing of intellectual property and technology. So after that, things became a little bit more quiet and it was only nice words from the Dutch government. So more recently, we have also we have written a second joint letter, which was also co-signed by a lot of Dutch NGOs, asking for the Dutch government to pressure pharmaceutical companies into sharing their intellectual property and know-how. This we again translated into a motion, and which was oh, sorry, Rosanna, can you go back to the slides? And this was again translated into a motion, and it was passed unanimously. So we have gathered some great support in the Dutch Parliament for CTAP, and I would also like to encourage you guys to write a similar letter, because we need more national support for CTAP. So it's me or Rosanna who can put down the links to the two letters we have written as VEMOS, to members of parliament and to our government. So we have translated into English, so it makes it a lot easier for you to send the letter as well to your respective government and MPs. Yeah, and you can find more information on our national advocacy at our website. But if you need to have more information, my email is at the end of the presentation. You can always send me an email with any questions on CTAP or national advocacy. So yeah, over to Mirja.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for a very nice explanation of CTAP, of what we have been doing and what folks that are attending the session can pick up and do as well from their side to strengthen the advocacy towards that. So in my presentation, we are going to take a step back. You saw the questions in the initial poll that we put in the beginning, and this is around these questions that I'm going to focus. So in general, our angle into our advocacy for CTAP, for COVAX, for what Tom presented, it's really from the angle of strengthening sustainably and equitably health systems. And a key, let's say, building block of a health system has to do with health financing. So now we're going to take a step back and see the health financing of a health system from a broader macroeconomic perspective. Rosanna, you can go ahead. So a key term that I think is very useful for advocates of public health and global health to know is the fiscal space for health, which in very simple terms is the flexibility that the government has in their spending choices for their health sector. And the WHO suggests some ways to increase this fiscal space for health, and I have them here on the screen. So very briefly, they focus a lot on the macroeconomic conditions, on reprioritization of health within government budgets, on health-specific taxes, the earmarked taxes, as we say, the sin taxes, you maybe have heard of them, increasing the efficiency and public financial management in the health sector, and increase in health-specific aid and grants. But what we are wondering is that, are these ways enough? Are they sufficient to fill the gap that we need, the financial gap for a strong, sustainable and equitable health system? So about the earmarked taxes, the sin taxes on sugar, tobacco, alcohol, etc. They are important because they can raise some resources for the health system, but we have seen from some research that it's really not enough to fill the huge gap that is there. And here there are some examples that we found from some World Bank analysis that I have in the footnote. Then another issue that has been discussed a lot is how to improve efficiency and improve the public financial management. And this has been recently very much discussed within WHO circles and in countries as well. And it's key, of course, because it has been a problem, the underutilization of resources in the health sector, inefficiencies, misappropriation, etc. But we have not been able yet to see, okay, how much in monetary terms we can gain from that. So it's been discussed a lot, but we still don't know if really can bring a lot of resources. And then we have the reprioritization of health in government budget, that it has been repeated again and again. But reprioritization, when your overall budget is anyway low, is going to bring very little additional resources into the health sector. And I'm going to show you in the next slide what I mean. So what do we see in this slide? With the purple horizontal line, the 112, is, let's say, an international benchmark of $112 per capita in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, the health-related Sustainable Development Goals and universal health coverage. And let's see what the columns mean. So this is data from the WHO that shows, in green, what is the per capita in US dollars expenditure in health from the state in some African countries. And you see that is much lower than the 112, with very few exceptions. With the yellow columns, and that's the interesting thing, what do we see? We see what the per capita expenditure would be if each one of those countries would reprioritize and allocate 5% of their GDP in health. 5%, which is an international relative benchmark. And we see that even if they increase the allocation relatively, Still, they're not going to meet the absolute amount, exactly because we are talking about resource limited contexts where the pie is small. So even if you increase the size of the piece of the pie, your piece of the pie is still going to be low. So this is why we think that this is also has some limited potential reprioritization if you're talking about this size of economies. Next slide, please. So we see health as a human right, and the state has the obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill it. And in order to do so, they need to explore and put in place all possible legislative, administrative, and importantly, budgetary measures. So we see that states must utilize and explore aggressively, let's say, all possible resources to realize the human right to health. We saw some of the suggestions, and we are thinking, are there alternatives to that can bring more resources to the public health sector? Next slide. So there is a very interesting work that has been done by ILO, the International Labour Organization, and UN Women in 2019 that explore avenues to expand this fiscal space for health that I described before. And they add more ways than what I discussed in my previous slides. And I'm going to focus in some of them now that we consider that have a huge potential, that are really big untapped resources that the health sector can exploit. And they go beyond the health sector, okay? So we are looking now more into the broader macroeconomic environment, which I think is really important for health workers, for health advocates to also know this stuff, to strengthen our advocacy. So first, there is the issue of illicit financial flows. So illicit financial flows is money that is leaving a country through tax avoidance and tax evasion from big corporations that are not paying their fair share of their tax in the countries where they operate. So let's see what is the opportunity there. Here I have made a comparison. On the first one, you see that based on the last UNCTAD report on economic development in Africa, they calculated that in 1 year, Africa lost $89 billion in illicit financial flows. And at the same time, the financial gap to achieve the health-related sustainable development goals in not only Africa, but in all low and middle income countries, it's much smaller than that. So we have a huge pot of money sitting there. And to go into a country-specific example, I put here an example from a research that I did in Uganda, where we saw that the amount lost from illicit financial flows in 2018, it was much larger than the whole domestic health budget of the country. And this really struck me as the status of things. And it's also a very strong argument for it. Next slide. The other topic I'm going to touch upon, and of course these topics are huge, and I just want to give you some highlights on that, is the issue of debt and how managing debt or restructuring sovereign debt or debt relief can really also increase resources for the social sector, including health. So let's see some more details. On the left, I have some findings from research done by Eurodad that compared how much some governments are paying in their health domestically and how much do they spend on debt. And the numbers are percentages of their overall government expenditure. And you see that in many cases, countries are spending more in debt service than in health. And we did some calculation to see the average. That's what you see on the right. And we saw that in Africa, debt service on average is more or less 12%. That's on average. There are countries that this is super high. It can go up to 40, 50%. Whereas the average of government expenditure on health is half of that, is 6%. So again, you see another opportunity for raising resources. And let's see the last option that I wanted to focus on today, which was also mentioned by Tom before, and it's the increase in aid and transfers and also improving alignment of these aid and transfers. So let's see what is happening now. maybe you are all familiar already with the 0.7% of GNI commitment that OECD countries have taken for allocation in aid. We see here that, well, this is not happening. Only very few countries have met their commitment. And even though there is a potential of 541 billion US dollar in official development aid, what we actually have is much less than that. It's like a third. So you see there that also in terms of solidarity, and we are not talking about charity here, we are talking about global commitments that have to do with global solidarity. High-income countries are not meeting their commitments. So this is another way that we see of increasing the resources. Of course, it has all the challenges that development aid can bring. But we see here that when we're talking about global solidarity, we are not still meeting our commitments. So it's to change the way of thinking from what countries need individually, high-income countries need individually, and this is what Tom said as well in his presentation, to spark a movement that benefit all of the countries. So to bring solidarity in political movements for increase in fiscal space. And I'm going to close with that. So you can go to the next and final slide, and I'm going to hand over to Amanda for a recap. And thank you all for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Miria, for that presentation, and Tom as well for an overview. I think that what the two speakers have given us is real insight into what this solidarity and advocacy in solidarity and partnership will look like. So just quickly to recap, I think my key takeaways from Tom's presentation was the issue of vaccine availability. We as advocates, I think, cannot leave the situation as it is. I think for me, the outstanding question that he asked was, if we think that 20% of vaccines availability would be unacceptable in high-income countries, why do we think that this should be acceptable in low-income countries? I think for me, that's a food for thought takeaway question that I think we want to discuss in this session, and what can we do about that? And I think that Tom also touched on yes, maybe some political will is there. A few countries are really supporting. There's some, interesting statements that are being made, but that is not matching action. And I think what we are looking at is, let's put our action to where our words and our mouth is. And so it's not just enough to speak about this, but we want to see action. And so what type of solidarity in advocacy, what type of partnership will it take to move those political statements into real action? And I think you also spoke about this, we need to move from this donations charity base to this pure partnership solidarity. I think you spoke about the holding of vaccines at the cost of low-income countries. I think you mentioned one highlight for me was also 60% of vaccines in 2021 will only go to 16% of the population. And I think you kind of like wrapped it up to speak about, what are the challenges and what are the issues and what are some of the solutions that have been put in place. And so that linked us into the manufacturing capacity that you spoke about, the focus of this capacity also concentrated in a few regions in the world, largely in the north, of course, and the need to decentralize, and the need to decentralize this, and the move from will need advocacy, it will need solidarity, to need partnership in advocacy. And so the solution that is there, sit up, but that is being put in place to share IP, data, and tech transfer. And you gave us a real example of what VEMOS has been doing towards its government, but also engaging in the EU and the global context in terms of really pushing for this mechanism. And you've shared in the chat box, for those of you who joined later, some examples of letters that you were writing. And I think for me, this links to earlier in the plenary discussion, where we're not just looking at challenging institutions and organizations that are present in this plenary session, but also individuals, because I think we saw what Dr. Saraya, for example, is doing as an individual person, and I think that it's something collectively, individually, and we do not have to wait like, okay, I'm not in an organization, like who do I reach out to? But I think this is the platform where we want to discuss how we can move this forward in terms of advocacy. And Mary, I think you've shared very critical, important points. The options, varied options to expand fiscal space. You spoke about taxation, the efficiency, the aids and the grants, but the question that you asked, is it enough? And I think this was also touched on in the plenary session. The pie is small, especially in resource limited context. You've really emphasized that we need to look at health as a human right. And I think that all of us, I believe in this session, agree to that, and that we need to start thinking of health as a human right. And you touched on something that I guess is also important for advocacy. How can we get the states to utilize and explore aggressively or possible options, and whether this is happening enough? I think also in plenary, there was that mention for the UK. I think Dr. Saraya also moaned, like, drop from 0.7 to 0.5. What are all these options? I think you've highlighted 3 for me that are takeaways. The elimination of illicit financial flows, the management of debt. You've given us very, very interesting figures in terms of how much loss in terms of finances and how much countries actually spending in servicing debt than towards health. And I think the issue of increasing aid and transfers and looking at the potential that is there vis-a-vis what actually is happening. So that's a quick recap for me, takeaways from the discussions from the 2 speakers. And I would like to open it up for the participants to just share with us, like, what are your thoughts? Any questions, any experiences, any things that you're doing in terms of advocacy, like also maybe to answer the question, like, what will it take? Because I think that for this conference, we also just don't want to come and speak about things, but what about at the end of the session, we come to an agreement that maybe this is what we participants want to move and move forward. And I would like to hear from participants, what are some of the initiatives and things that you're taking to move these issues forward? What do you need from all of us? How can we help? How can we support? Who can we link to? It's open to the floor and to the participants for questions, for sharing, for learning, for anything. So I will just be looking at the hands that will be raised. If I don't see your name, of course, please just feel free to just jump in and share with us any questions, any comments, what you're working on, what you're doing, and how can everybody else help and support that advocacy.
They see me.
I may not be able to see all the hands up, so please, you're also free to just unmute yourself and jump in.
Okay, my name is Eunice from Zambia, Country Director 30 Zambia. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to check in terms of advocacy for countries like Zambia where the vaccine is still not clear when it should be in the country. What advice would you give in terms of advocacy on the activities that we should start preparing for that time when the vaccine will come? So what mechanisms can we use?
I think somebody else needs to mute. Tumaini, if you don't mind. Okay, go ahead, Eunice. Sorry about that.
Oh, can I start again?
Hello, I just joined, so I don't know what is happening. So maybe I need some time to familiarize first.
Okay, yeah, we just asking you, please, if you could mute your mic. And I think, Eunice, if I heard you correctly, you were asking what advice for countries where vaccine is still far from like reality of getting to the ground? What can countries and what can organizations, what can people start to think about? So I just want to see if somebody else has another question. Maybe we can take 2-3 questions, and then I will ask our panelists maybe to respond to that. Okay, maybe while others are thinking about it, Tom, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, thanks, Eunice, for that question. I think it is very important that in order for organizations to advocate for equitable access, it's, first of all, I think what really helped us, WEMOS, in the Netherlands to advocate not just as one organization, but really to have a broad movement that is not just the access to medicines movement in the Netherlands, but also a broader range of experts, civil society organizations, individuals that basically are making the same statement and asking the same. Make sure that you as a government do everything in your power to make sure that vaccines are made available. So what that could mean for the African region or African countries is to make that case towards the WHO, but also towards other WHO member states, is that we do need a global mechanism to increase manufacturing capacity, to take away those 2 barriers that I talked about. So that one barrier being intellectual property and one barrier being the sharing of know-how. And I think that actually a lot of African countries are already doing that by saying that, okay, there's a discussion going on. I didn't talk about that in my presentation, but there's a discussion going on at the World Trade Organization to temporarily waive patents for COVID-19 technologies. So with the support of African countries, but also other countries around the world for that patent waiver, that would mean a huge deal, because then it's recognized that these patents are actually a barrier in maximizing global production capacity. And a lot of countries from the global north, they don't want to recognize patents as a barrier. They say, well, patents are not a barrier, they facilitate innovations. And what I try to explain is that we have seen so far for COVID-19 that it's actually the public funding and the cooperation between companies and governments that have enabled us to have a vaccine within 1 year. But what we need to do next is to increase this cooperation and increase the global manufacturing capacity. And what I want to add is that what was really important for lobby and advocacy in the Netherlands was timing. So we published this joint letter, the last joint letter, as the news messages got out that AstraZeneca was not able to live up to its promises and deliver on the vaccines that they have promised to deliver. So there was a lot of public outcry of why is AstraZeneca not able to deliver it, and that really made a case for our argument of sharing intellectual property and know-how so that other vaccine manufacturers are enabled to produce it as well.
Great. Thanks a lot, Tom. So in summary, I think that you can join movements that are already calling for this within your country. And I think that please also, I think there will be contacts at the end of the slides we will share. Reach out and we can also make those connections. I think indeed there's a lot of African countries that are calling for this TRIPS waiver. We can plug you into that movement to add your voice, to push. And I think also, as Tom has mentioned, this making a case to WHO for these member states, to remove these barriers. I think one thing that I also just want to highlight, I think it's Action Aid and PSI and a few other organizations have also launched a campaign to call for this mass vaccination of healthcare workers. I think there was those figures that came out 2 weeks ago, if not last week, 17,500 people, healthcare workers that have died from COVID. And I think that's something that we can also plug in and we can share. So I really also just want to allow, if there's any more questions, like maybe 2-3 questions, if you can be very brief, because we are moving towards the top of the hour, but I don't want any other thoughts not to come out. So thoughts, reflections, sharing what you're doing, and what can we do together? How can we support what you're doing? And yeah, what can we do together, basically? Again, please jump in. If I don't see your hand raised, just unmute yourself and jump in.
I think I see Sharon unmuting herself.
Hi.
If you want to speak, yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry. I'm just dipping in and out of all of the sessions. I'm
Okay.
I'm here to do some graphics and visual minutes, so excuse me for popping in mid-session.
I feel it's Ben here from THET. I feel sort of slightly helpless about the intellectual property arguments, in the sense that, you know, that is so clearly the right thing to do. But winning that argument just seems so difficult. I saw Tony Blair, famous former UK Prime Minister, of course, came out in favour of that argument this week, and that gave me a bit of hope. But I suppose, you know, we've got a government in the UK that's been very generous in terms of funding for the COVAX initiative, but isn't addressing that fundamental question about IP.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, Ben, that things are moving. Also within Europe, there's more and more voices asking for governments to support the TRIPS waiver. And there's more, let's say there's some slight movement within governments to also support the TRIPS waiver. But what is one of the downsides of CTAP is that it's a voluntary mechanism. So it's up to pharmaceutical companies to share their IP and know-how. However, I do think there is a solution to that problem, and that is a topic that we have been working on in the Netherlands over the last 2 years, and that is to attach conditionalities to public funding to make sure that they have pro-public interest conditions attached to them. So that could be conditions on transparency of R&D costs. That could be conditions on the transparency of the contracts. There's been a huge debate in Europe on what do the contracts between pharmaceutical companies and the European Commission, what is actually in them? Who is bearing responsibility regarding all kinds of liability questions? And there is a lot of uncertainty as to what the exact prices are that are agreed upon. And now that we know that some of the African countries are paying more for their vaccines than high-income countries, I think it's only fair to ask governments, okay, if you invest in pharmaceutical companies, that's a good thing. But if you invest, make sure to attach conditions that, for instance, demand the sharing of intellectual property and know-how through CTAP. So that could be a solution to the relatively voluntary characteristics of CTAP and make it a bit more mandatory. And I want to say that it's not too late to do that, even though a lot of contracts have been signed, but there will be a need for follow-up contracts, because we will need boosters for the vaccines. We will need additional supplies of treatments. So new contracts will be made, and we are pushing the Dutch government to make sure that these conditionalities are in place.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you so much, Tom. Yes.
May I give a plug for the next session? but Miria, I think, wants to speak, so I'm barging in.
I just wanted to add something on what Tom said very quickly, that the advocacy around the CTAP, apart from the national level, we are trying to also plug it in the global level advocacy that we are doing. So every time that we are creating advocacy messages towards global health initiatives like the Global Financing Facility or Global Fund or Gavi or the World Bank, now we are trying to link it as well with this message on CTAP and equality in vaccination. So it's really repeating also the message in any opportunity that you have, because there are global health organizations that and initiatives that can also become advocates after pressure of that and support the cause. And I'll end with that.
Great. So I will give the floor to Ben, and then I will wrap up afterwards.
Oh, thanks so much, Amanda. So if anyone's wondering how they can, as an individual, become a more effective advocate, join us for the later session, which will focus on tools for effective advocacy at an individual level. But can I just say thank you for this? Was really, it's so important, the topics you're discussing, and you do it with such expertise. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you so much to our panelists, Miria and Tom, for really sharing that information. I think that the contacts are up on the screen. I think that even for some of you who are like, this is really interesting, but what can we do at our level as an organization, as an individual? What are the opportunities? Feel free to reach out to both Tom and Miria. And I think we can make those linkages and connections to the platforms, to a lot of the ongoing advocacy that, you know, you might take a peek and think, okay, I think this is something that I can do. But just to thank you all for being a very interesting audience, and for listening. And so we will see you in the next session. And I think definitely, as Ben has said, the practical sessions and the conversations do not end here. Actually, the conversations continue. The other comments, contacts are in the chat box as well. I think that you can also access that and just copy the emails and the contacts where you can reach all of us. So we are exactly at the top of the hour, and I believe that we have a short 10-15 minute break before we go into the next session. And so see you and have a great day, rest of the day. Thanks a lot and goodbye.
Thank you for having us.